A couple of things that I mentioned last week as sort of signposts to give you a week to chew on if you were so interested. I'm going back now and stuck up a few bricks around the foundation. Number one, if you recall last week, I mentioned to you that in the ordinary world, a quite accurate description, an unknown description heretofore, would be that all horizontal systematic approaches to life actually dealt in the realm of that good old proverb about divide and conquer. That as opposed to systems such as a particular religion, a particular philosophical school of thought as they're called, as opposed to them in fact bringing together people and in some way trying to produce a cohesive structure of thought and belief, that they are in fact, in a sense, rendering everything under consideration into smaller and smaller pieces, so as to make it eventually meaningless. Which, if you can see what I am pointing at, it's just one view. It's not the ordinary view, and it is a quite strange view, but it is a nonetheless correct view once you get in a position to see it this way. That religion, for instance, to pick an obvious, glaring example, from one quite real view, renders all of the so-called questions man has about good and evil, life after death, life before breakfast, renders all of this to the point that it's meaningless. Every now and then, life, in its wisdom of its body, produces some man somewhere or some woman that stands up and says, religion's a waste of time. I had all these questions and I joined the church and they didn't answer anything. Now, those people are in the minority. Those people are just sore heads. Those people are pimples. They're a passing pain in life's head. But the people who remain good followers of some religion, it is not that they believe everything's been answered. It has just been cut up into such small pieces that it's eventually become meaningless. Now, the systematic approaches that life has produced in the body of man, these systems do not make such statements. But what I wanted to do is give you a week, those of you that thought you heard anything of potential interest, to try and see on your own that as opposed to schools of philosophy, the whole idea of human philosophy, religion, as opposed to some smart aleck here and there being driven to point out that these institutions are not answering questions, they miss the point. Part of their job is to take these apparent important questions and cut them up, divide them into smaller and smaller pieces to the point that nobody can digest it, nobody has any interest, it just becomes meaningless. That's as good as an answer. All right. Comma. All right. If any of you can grasp into that, I want to expand it and point out to you that what I am doing is to divide up anew all of that that has already been rent, so that a few might perceive the original unity of it all. Binary consciousness might think there's got to be almost an opposite approach. So I'm going to have a sip here, and everybody can have a couple of seconds and think, could there be an opposite approach to what I just said? If so, what would it be? Here we go. Well, verbally, they put it all back together, right? Oh, you tried that. That is part of life's body also, is having people under the guise of philosophy, mysticism, metaphysics, religion, saying that we're going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We're going to put the Garden of Eden back together again. We're going to put man back in his original state of higher consciousness. Has it worked? Take another couple of seconds. Here we go. Has it worked? Well, do you believe in every fire sale that you see? Do you believe everyone who knocks on your door and says, my crew of aluminum siding people just happened to be in the neighborhood and we have some materials left over and just happened to notice what a beautiful house you had, madam? Are you the type to say, please come in? If you are, then you can ignore the rest of this. If you are, you will ignore the rest of this. Everything is already divided up to the point that it is about conquered. That is the way life is. I fully realize, as new as that was last week and as strange as it is verbally, that many of you didn't get anything last week and many of you still don't feel like you're getting anything out of it. But I'm pointing out to you that the appearance in life, don't just take my examples of me saying ordinary systematic approaches and then me saying religions and schools of philosophy and etc. If you can expand your vision, you will see that everything of which man can be conscious. You remember some of the divide up aspects of consciousness that I pointed out in the past, being able to divide things so that they can be remembered, being able to cut things into their binary opposites. That's the only way that they are rendered useful to ordinary consciousness. In that same way, you don't have to just rely upon an example of mine or your own of a, quote, system itself that you can identify as an institution, as a body of thought or belief. You can look at the whole range of anything of which man can be conscious, and if you're conscious of it, it has been chopped up from some originality. It has been chopped up from some singularity. And the more it is chopped up to a certain point, the more you believe that you're understanding it. If you don't believe that, why in the hell do you think God created Cliff's Notes? Up to a certain point, you believe that you are increasing your understanding if you read an article. If you decide that you were interested in particle physics, and you went and tried to read reviews of papers that were read at last year's particle physics convention and motorcycle race down in Houston. And if you tried to read it and you thought, well, there's too much math, I don't understand all the terms, then you'd keep your eye out in the New York Times for the weekly science article. And if you tried it and it was too hard, then you would end up watching out for an article on particle physics that might be in Popular Mechanics or Red Book. And you'd finally get to the point that it seemed as though it has gotten to your level. All right, now I can grasp this, I can start here. But what has happened in a sense, and I'm not speaking in a quantitative sense that it's better or worse, we're talking about the ordinary world. It has been chopped up. And you feel like this is a exposition. It is coming to a level, it is expanding itself to the point that even I may be able to get a foothold here and begin to understand it. Well, what's happened, it has been divided up. But then it gets to a certain point. Now, this is not the way ordinary consciousness looks at it. It believes, well, I got tired of it. I forgot about it. I learned all I wanted to know. But what happened was it got chopped up to the point that you believe, I can almost swallow it. I'm going to be able to swallow this and digest it. I'm going to get something out of it. I'm going to enjoy it. But then it gets finer and finer, and next thing you know, you've lost interest. It became meaningless. And somebody says, hey, I found a new book on particle physics written for the layman, and since you were interested in it 2 months ago, I bet you'd like to see it. And you go, well, I'm kind of busy. Or they let you borrow it, and you never read it. And you don't know why. It's become useless. It's become meaningless to you. All right, how about those, if you looked at what seem to be more blue circuit-based religions, there seem to be people that have great fear about being alive, great fear of failing, great fear of being misused. Then according to the ministers, and the people seem to agree, they got fear about dying. What's going to happen to them? They cannot give a guarantee. You can sit from the sidelines if you were so driven as to be a hardwired cynic, temporarily for life's purpose, and you could say, how can people believe that? Even if they are afraid of dying, how can they believe this guy with a cheap rug on and a polyester suit when he says, God said so-and-so right here, and here's what he meant, and here's what's going to happen to you when you die if you give us enough money. People go, amen, talk about it, right on. How can they believe that? The man can't guarantee it. They're fools, and you don't understand. The whole process has been to the point that let us assume that there was some basis of the people who were had a fear of dying. They have cut it up to the point. They've gone there week after week, not unlike some of you people coming here, and they've heard the man preach and wave around the so-called holy book and talk about John 7:14 and Ecclesiastes 9:12 and Fatso chapter 69 or whatever it is, and they keep talking about here's what God meant, here's what happened 2,000 years ago. And in a sense, you sit there and you listen, and it's as though you're back in your mother's arms somewhere, and you're afraid of the dark, and your mother or your father sits there and rocks you back and forth and sings some English phrase over and over and over and over, and you finally go to sleep. You think that is different from being in church, being in the temple, the rhythmic praying, the kind of hypnotic music that goes on. You think you're not being put to sleep. Nothing wrong going on, but people go there to have all this cut into such small pieces, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, that nobody gives a damn anymore. That's not the way they look at it, but it's as though now I don't worry about it. Worry about what? Well, the kind of things I used to worry about, which were, well, I used to be upset with life before I joined this church and gave them a lot of money and came here every week. And how do you feel now? Well, I don't know. Are you as upset? Well, maybe about it. I'm not upset about being not upset anymore. Now back to what I was pointing out about doing this. If any of you can see, in a sense, I have taken that which is already mechanically rent. It's mechanically rent in you people before I met you. Doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter what your religious background was, it doesn't matter what apparent horizontal institutions had the biggest effect on you, which was, of course, no effect whatsoever, but you thought it was. It was genes reflecting neon signs outside, and you thought it was some kind of environmental impact. But at any rate, you would believe that the institutions, ordinary consciousness, had already had its impact on you, and things had already been rent sufficiently. And you were expecting, in a sense, without necessarily defining in these terms, that if you ever found a world-famous guru, such as, that somebody would put all this back together again. This seems to all come apart. It seems as though when I was a child and my parents says, there's a God somewhere, and he'll take care of everything, and he knows everything, not unlike me, your father. And then you find out your father was a coward. Then you discover that your mother was a drunk. And it all seemed to fall apart. What was falling apart was what seemed to be a whole panorama of reality spread out before the child. The child's consciousness gets chopped up, as it must, or else you would not become conscious. But it seems to get chopped up to the point that it becomes more and more meaningless. There's nowhere to lean, nothing to depend on. Everything falls apart. Woe is me. You're now an adult. And the belief is, without analyzing it that way, that somebody's going to put this back together, and you can't put it back together. Well, you can, but we're back to my old example that got me disbarred from the, where doctors hang out, hospital. They won't let me down there. Is the screwdriver up the nose. That'll put it all back together again. It helps. A Phillips screwdriver is the most efficient, and then you take a tack hammer and go, and it's all put back together. Other than that, it cannot be put back together is the point. There is nothing to put back together. That's the belief that in some way you have fallen from grace, and if you found some connection to the cosmic forces, that you would be raised back up to your original place. But now I'm assuming, in my foolish senility, that most of you in a good day has gotten to the point that you realize you hadn't fallen from anywhere. There is nothing put back together. What I am doing is taking that which is already sufficiently divided, sufficiently confusing, sufficiently rendered almost moot, and all of your beliefs, your ideas, no matter who you are, no matter what your background was, no matter what your culture was, no matter what your education was. And in a sense, what I have done, and it's not just been horizontally, which would be bad enough if it could be done, but I have taken that which is already sufficiently divided, and I have rent it further. I have rent it anew. I have rent it at a right angle. And a few people can take this process. It's already been rent. It's already been divided to the point that almost everything is meaningless. If you don't like meaningless, if you find it confusing, everything has been rendered terminally confusing. And what I have done is take that condition and rent it even further. And what it can do for a few people is you begin, I guess I can let you believe in miracles. It begins to strike you an increasingly precise picture of the original singularity, the original unity of it all, which is what divided humanity in times past used to refer to as the need, the goal of knowing oneself. which in the ordinary world divide and conquer, is nothing. That's like people saying, well, I got a real bad temper. I know that. Now what? I don't feel any better. I admitted it. I got a terrible temper. If I have a mortal weakness, it is my terrible temper. I know that. Now what? When does enlightenment take place? And it doesn't. That is just the cinemascope of one span of reality, and it's been divided up so that this one person can say, I am so-and-so, such as, I am an angry person, I have a bad temper. The only way to know yourself, let me be truthful, not the only way. The way that I have been pursuing here is to take that which has already been sufficiently divided to render it either moot, useless, terminally confusing, and to rent it even further. That's the end of that song for this week. Last week I also mentioned that the same way that the planet is divided up into communities, that you can see individuals as communities. And the three examples I was going to use that have no particular pertinence since they don't really reflect what I was getting at, but if you recall, I used oasis and then town and city, being a progressively more complex and paralleling the progressive structure that I have pointed out, drawn of man's factory self, going from the lower regions to the higher regions, and the oasis being that which would be a temporary meeting place, one where those living in an oasis-based community would only meet periodically, and they would meet almost exclusively on the basis of mutual that is, and self-gratification of red circuit needs. What you've got to see, or what I want you to see, that on this planet right now, all of these extreme cases are becoming increasingly difficult to find, increasingly rare, since the whole world is becoming what? Homogenized more and more. But there are places on this planet right now that the people involved, they're still nomadic, carrying around tents and etc. All of you people surely know as much about contemporary events as I do, that there are a few people left like that. What seems to hold them together, if at all, is almost blood kin, family units. The rest of the time, if they get together, very often it is at a literal oasis, but other times it could be places where the term oasis is not necessarily pertinent since they don't live in a desert all the time, but it's simply a place that seems to be, to some degree, mutually beneficial. They can go there such as a water hole, or they go there because it is a central location. They go there because it might be shady. But it's some place that through some kind of use that they periodically meet. Now the point I didn't rub your nose in, that I was hoping some of you at least would immediately jump on, is all of this takes place inside the few proper people. All three of these are going on. They're going on in other people. It's been divided up to such a degree, and they are hardwired to such a point that they have to find what seems to be some central voice in their own partnership, that one or other of these communities seems to be the one in charge. But the more balanced you are for the few people, which of course compared to everybody else, the more unbalanced you are. You damn fuck-ups, you mutants, that you don't have just a strong single voice that, yes, I am a town. Or you can look at me and tell city. City, city, no doubt. Which of course is like all these people that's won, females winning beauty contests, males winning weightlifting contests, and then the first time they get a good interview, what do? Listen, I'm real concerned. I don't want people to think I'm just a pretty face. Hell, I got brains, I can think. I have some real important thoughts. I assume by now, again, I hope I'm not just wishfully hoping that all you people understand, because it's already happened to you, and when people got to immediately defend themselves, when people say, hey, I ain't that kind of person, you all remember, yes, they are. Back to the main path. for the few people who are mutantly less than one-sidedly balanced out of a triaxial situation, you've got to see that in you there is a community still alive that operates in the oasis zone. Well, men, sometimes it's sex, just to give you some place to start. It can be simply food. It can be all forms of so-called physical gratification. The town I use to describe as a more complex community. And it would be one that had at least semi-permanent structures, even physically structures, and institutions. Institutions being not necessarily a material entity, but they have seemed to have developed some laws or morals. There seems to be some agreed upon. God knows where some of it came from. Just as far back as anybody can remember, it seems that in the town they agreed that they would not spit in each other's food. Well, who decided that? Nobody can remember. But it just seems to be, I don't know, it just seems a decent thing is not spit in each other's food. As far back as I can remember, my father told me not to, and he said his father told him not to. In the oasis, I wouldn't count on that. The oasis can be a dangerous place. There's always shifting, people coming and going, and there are no even semi-permanent institutions or structures there. The town community also seems to offer some food for social needs. And you would begin to see the first stages of so-called artistic expression. There are communities literally on this planet, on that part of life's body, that seem to be in the town state, in the town condition. Many of them, whole countries I could point out. Lesser legal entities than the country. I could point out areas of certain countries. But I also note that in you people sufficiently mutilated, mutinated, simultaneously with the oasis community is the township going on. The third one that I pointed out last week I call the city, which would be much more complex than the town community and almost indescribably, to coin a phrase, complex than the oasis. It would be a place that had permanent structures, permanent institutions, and not just necessarily standards of conduct and morality that seem to have a vague history. They would be to the point of having legislative bodies, or some that would have some identifiable government that would be issuing edicts or laws saying, you shall not spit in your neighbor's food, or we'll bring you to the king, and he'll spit in your eye and cut off your tongue. So it's not just custom. And the primary aspect I pointed out to you last week was in the city, it would be unique compared to the first two, would be that in the city, thinking of action in many areas would be becoming as important as acting itself, which would not be true at all in the oasis. All they're doing is acting, insofar as this can be described comparably. Thinking of action would have a very limited importance in a town. It would be the beginnings of it now, or you would not have any code of conduct. You would not have the ability, the wherewithal to seed the so-called creative arts, and there would be no possibility of feeding social needs. You would still not have any of the trappings of civilization, and so there'd be a little. But what you would find in the city would be increasing areas wherein the thinking of acting was more important than the acting itself. The transfer of information. Everything that would be, as I guess it would be referred to now in contemporary Western areas, whole countries becoming, whole populations becoming more service industries than manufacturing industries. That is, people doing jobs that if you saw them in a silent movie, you're not even sure what the hell they're doing. They're not working on an assembly line. They're not planning food. And yet, if you watch the silent movie, at the end of the week, somebody hands them money. But if you watch them all week and you try to figure, what are they doing to contribute to the benefit of humanity on this planet, you wouldn't know. Some of you people laughing, of course, we could come film you. And you'd be one of them. There's nothing personal to you, but you see what I'm saying. If you were left to almost a oasis community, watching the film of you, they'd look and think, well, he's not killing anybody, or she's not. They're not planting food. They're not hunting. What in the hell are they doing? How do they live doing that? They're sitting at a desk, and we watch this thing, and I take a nap, and I wake up, and 8 hours later, the film's still running. They get up. They straighten their clothes up, whatever it is they're wearing. They leave, and they come back the next day, and they sit there all day, and they talk in this thing, and they write on whatever they're doing. And somebody pays them for that. What in the hell are they doing? That should be a glaring example of me saying that there are specific areas wherein thinking about action becomes as important as acting itself. All right, the little part I wanted to bring back up of revisiting communities this week is to make sure that you understand that all this has some significance internally if you can begin to see it. And that you could ask yourself such questions as, how stringently divided can I see this community aspect in me, in other people, of an oasis, a town, and a city? Wherein can I see in me and other people, do their interests seem to overlap, that there does seem to be a graduation that I can see, taking my descriptions, that I could see a township in me and in other people operating, but I can see a burgeoning city. I can see how the township here in me in a certain area or in somebody else, if it was pushed a little, if it was fed a little bit, that town could grow into a city. It's on the verge of becoming so complex that some of the activities, some of the interests of the town are beginning to get to an area wherein they're going to be thinking about action instead of the action they're doing now. It's how it begins to dovetail. In the same way that I told you originally, it was a misnomer for me to talk about 3 circuits. And then I drew you interlocking circles, and I had some drawn up where they're 3D aspect of how they would intertwine, and I pointed out to you that they really cannot or should not be spoken of as circuits. It would be circuitry. And it's a gradual process that they're all feeding off one another. They're all feeding one another. And you cannot separate except for the fact, or except for the purpose of trying to rent that which is already divided to the point that you begin to see the original unity of it all. But to ask yourself, to use this, of how does this community picturization, how can I see distinct separations? How can I see overlaps? How can I see the same institutions, in a sense, operating in all 3 communities under different names when you move from the town to the city? Such as, I can see in the oasis that they have sort of a, you might say, a part-time, or who knows who appointed, shaman, that if 2 or 3 people or 2 or 3 smaller communities happen to meet at the oasis at the same time and somebody drops dead from over fucking or over drinking, it's like almost an ad hoc person seems to pop up, and he'll say a few words, or they'll bury the person, the deceased, or they'll burn them, or they'll do something. But there seems to be almost a spontaneous picking out of a de facto rabbi or priest, and that's gone. But you can see the seeds of this turning into something a little more permanent, like an itinerant or a part-time minister in a town. But then when you get into the city, it becomes a full-time occupation. There is somebody given garb, supposedly educated. They have a permanent meeting place. They have a name. They're called Reverend, Father, Rabbi, Teacher, Mullah. But you can see the graduation. And you can see what the oasis people might refer to as a witch doctor, to use English words. There's not that much difference between a witch doctor and the Pope. It is the complexity of it. It is the apparent permanence of it. It is the needs of a more complex community out there and in here needing something, and the names get changed. the view of it gets changed. The complexity of it does increase, but there's still much in common. Now turning to 2 Romans chapter 4, subcategory Greek aluminum siding salesman. In spite of my best efforts, since religion continues to receive a bad rap from some quarters, and there are those of ordinary consciousness who believe that something is dreadfully amiss, of people still believing in gods and anti-gods, gods and demons. When you're dealing with binary consciousness, cannot you begin to see that it cannot be otherwise? Binary consciousness is the great revelator. It is the exposer. It is the presenter of one thing and one thing only, and that is the world of gods and demons. How could it be otherwise? If you have binary consciousness, and I don't care whether the word ever crossed your lips or within the confines of your own partnership, if you'd never heard the words gods and demons, which of course is impossible, but if you had not, it would not matter because you would have your own variation of it. When you're dealing with binary consciousness, the only world presented, the only world possible, the only world that consciousness of which it can perceive is a world of gods and a world of demons. Your own partnership, any argument you want to have on my terms, fine. All you're going to have is your partnership use synonyms for gods and demons. I don't care what it is, whether it's intelligence, whether it's New Age liberal intelligence versus out-of-date, anachronistic superstition. That's what the world is divided up into. Gods and demons. But all of this, apparently intellectually based, criticism that many partnerships have, are people believing that this has been a millstone around man's neck. People believing that, at least in the Western version of history, that, for instance, the Catholic Church has been an absolute direct hindrance upon the civilizing process of man. And there are many quarters wherein that is a acceptable currency intellectually. And of course, they jump on such things as the Inquisitions, they jump on such things as specific popes and how they raped, plundered, took 2 or 3 mistresses, and just generally made fools of themselves. But they missed the whole point. They're absolutely blind. We would not be near as civilized were it not, just for instance, for the Catholic Church, and that's not alone. It doesn't matter whether you're a Catholic or not. And yet, the dividing up into reality, over and over, into definable, digestible, intellectually acceptable pieces, such as religion, then subdivisions, the different religions, then the subdivisions on that, the different sects, the cults, the orthodox, the reformed, the renewed, the invigorated, the regressive, the conservative, the liberal. You get to the point that who cares? What are you? Are you a liberal? Yeah, I'm liberal. How about you, sir? Yeah, whatever he is, I am. But then believing that this has been a hindrance to man, you cannot see the unity of it. In ordinary consciousness, acting as critic, based upon how you are wired up already, may or may not find any interest in criticizing religion. It may find interest in criticizing the economic structures of the world, the apparent political structures throughout history. But it has been a unified progression, and there's only consciousness that cuts it up. But at the heart of this consciousness, at the heart of the apparent criticism that life speaks through some areas of humanity, of saying this is absolute walking ignorance for people to believe in gods, or worse than that, people believe in demons. We're not talking about 3,000 years ago. There are people who believe in demons. I'm going to tell you and ask you one more time. No, I'll tell you. You got no choice. If you're dealing with binary consciousness, it is going to present to you, and to everybody, a world of gods and demons, and that's it. There is a cleavage. It is almost the initial cleavage. Those of you who are interested, and you might ponder why all these communities throughout the world have some notion of OS, original sin. That's the initial cleavage. That is binary consciousness. You cannot be conscious until, first off, you're aware of the fact, hey, the whole world's divided up into gods and demons. That's it. You could have been raised in a den of atheists, in a pride of atheists, even a herd of atheists. But as soon as you were conscious first off of one thing. That here we got a universe of gods and demons. I'm not going much further with this in any particular direction, this paragraph. But to point out to you that many people, it's been going on for as far as recorded history, and many of you have the partnership that finds that to be offensive intellectually. That this is a sign of man's potential for involution. It is proof positive of man's continuing dependence upon ignorance, superstition. And you're an idiot. You have been blinded. You have been conquered by the continual division. The initial division would take you back closer to an intellectual Big Bang. It would take you back closer to the original unity of it all. That you could not be conscious until this initial cleavage. And the initial cleavage is a world of gods and demons. And it's still a world of gods and demons. I don't give a damn what you call it. I don't care whether now to you it is a matter of the liberals versus the conservatives. Whether it's a matter of the humane people as opposed to the inhumane. You're talking about gods and demons. That's it. And it can't be otherwise. And only those who have been absolutely intellectually conquered by this continuing division, only those do not have the potential to hear and pursue some of this for me to continue to rent it to the point that you can then begin to see the initial unity of it all. When you see the unity of it all, of course, we can't talk about it. That's why I keep hoping that some of you get there so I can have somebody to talk to. Because then there's nothing to talk about, don't you see? Along similar lines, let me point out something that some of you, I can feel in my mystical way, have already experienced. More than just a few of you. And you've never had any description, I've never talked about it, and it's not available in life. Let me point out a kind of dissatisfaction that is a proof, once a few of you can see it, of where your consciousness has staked at least some outpost at some time. And it has to do with an area that I've covered in several views, several descriptions over the last few years. First off, ordinary consciousness. Let me rerun this and give you yet another verbal description to remind you of it. For ordinary consciousness to work at its most mechanically efficient, there must be the appearance of immediate and obvious opposition to what would appear to be immediate and obvious conclusions or immediate and obvious ideas. I'll say it again before I jump into the kind of dissatisfaction, the kind of experience that many of you have already had, and it was so quick you had to jump off of it. For ordinary consciousness to operate at its most mechanically efficient, which is not an attack now, but at its most mechanically efficient, there has got to be the appearance, always, the appearance of immediate and obvious opposition to whatever it is apparently in mind, whatever it is apparently consciousness is thinking about, is looking at, is considering. It's another aspect of binary consciousness. It is another aspect of human consciousness. But specifically, there is a kind of dissatisfaction that is available out in life to pursuing even information that is horizontally available, and no one notices it. And I have a prime example. I didn't even have to think of it. All I had to do was listen to the news a few nights ago. This was out in the ordinary media. But now listen, it's a great example. It's so good that I didn't even try to improve upon it. Someone was pointing out the trade difficulties between the United States of America and the United States of Japan. They were mentioning the ever-increasing and bothersome trade deficit between our two countries. Now listen fast. You don't have to know much about economics. And as always, economics, trade relations are not the point. But imagine that you were listening. And I'm going to just repeat more or less what they said in my own words. And so assume that this has some validity, some potential importance. And now you listen. Just ordinarily and follow what I'm saying. I'm just repeating the kind of thing that they were saying on the news. There's been this trade deficit. And those in charge of our economy have gone back to processes to devalue the relative worth of the U.S. dollar compared to the Japanese yen. And for the last few months, they have had, in that same line, glowing success. That the ratio between the U.S. dollar and the yen has continued to go like this, so that the U.S. dollar is worth less and less. The thinking being, now listen fast, I'm going to do it as quick as I can, but I want you to listen as though you're a person finding this of some interest. This would help balance the present trade deficit in that now Japanese goods coming to America would cost more, so that American consumers would not just continue to rush up and buy anything Japanese on the belief that was better quality for the money or for whatever reason. That now they're going to cost more. Now that they cost more, there are less dollars being spent here on Japanese products, less money from U.S. sources going to Japan. Now that they have less money over there, the companies making products that were previously big sellers in America are now selling less, and as a result they're having to lay off some employees. So now they're having increased unemployment in Japan. Now the Japanese, looking for ways to make their products more competitive again, without upsetting directly the United States when they're on the surface both trying to ease the trade deficit, they're now faced with growing unemployment. They're faced with the fact now that their Japanese products are costing more here than ever before. Now one of their attempts to overcome that is now the Japanese are building plants in America to build Japanese products and hire Americans who they can now get cheaper than they would have to pay the people back home. Now, if you were following all this, right along about here is where the yellow circuit goes. It is all reasonable if you listened. I think I kept it simple enough. That apparently the very things that they were trying to correct, they were going along, and it was doing so. in every step that I described of devaluing the U.S. dollar, driving down the price compared to the yen, was a beginning step to have the desired effect. It would keep Americans from spending so much money in this foreign market. All right, there we are. We're on the right track. But it keeps on, and it turns into at the very least, a binarily conceived circle. And by the time you get to the point that now Japan is building plants in America so that they can hire American employees to build Sony products instead of building them in Japan, what I wanted you to sense was the yellow circuit begins to get there, and even if you tried to listen, it gets to the point that it is dissatisfying, to say the very least. I could say it becomes frustrating. Now, not that all of you got that sensation with my description because you were not prepared for it, but the whole thing was reasonable, it was logical, it all made sense. But by the time that this story, this detailing of a horizontal news event, of a process taking place in life, gets around to Japan is now building plants in America and hiring American employees to build the Japanese products because they can get them cheaper, what's the next step in this logical sequence of news events? Well, the next step I'm trying to suggest to you is the yellow circuit shuts down. Now, it may have its own story. In your case, that just suddenly you turned your head and you decided to get up and get a cup of coffee. Or in the case of them telling the story, they didn't go any further. That was the end of the news report. But if you'd been listening, they said, and now as a consequence of the growing unemployment, as a consequence of the general market conditions in Japan, they now find it more profitable to build plants in America and hire American employees. If suddenly, if you're listening on the radio and your electricity went off and the radio went off, what I'm trying to get you to see is the ordinary yellow circuit. And ordinary people would not grab the radio and shake it and say, well, what comes next? Good grief, I got to get the power back on. By the time you get to that point, there is a kind of dissatisfaction. There is a kind of almost shutdown of the yellow circuit. It is getting too close to a kind of reality. It is getting too close to an area that can no longer be confined to binary reality. It cannot be confined to the 3D world. This thing is going to begin to swallow itself. It is getting to the point that the yellow circuit cannot literally comprehend it. It is like an overload of information. I guess you could say in the ordinary 3D world of you people dealing in service information and computers and dealing with transfer of info and data. But that's really just the 3D world. But that is the most immediate comparison I can throw at you. It is like an absolute overload, and the yellow circuit just doesn't want to hear anymore. It can't hear anymore. It becomes dissatisfied. It becomes overheated. It wants to blink its eyes. It just turns its head. That is a condition many people involved with this, you people, have hit before. And many times you thought, I'm on the verge of a major breakthrough in consciousness, but it was almost that you got to the point in consciousness went, ooh, and you had to get up and walk outside. You had to do all this and go, ooh, almost had it. But you get to a point, and ordinary consciousness cannot support you any longer. It cannot carry you any further, and nothing is amiss. It is a process that all of you are going through in various stages, sooner or later. What I want you to do is recognize the fact this goes on in life, and it's not recognized, and it goes on in people involved with this, but all you've done is reach the absolute limits of yellow circuit-based consciousness, or ordinary consciousness in toto. Your entire being has got to the point that consciousness will not go any further at that level. What comes after, and so now they're building plants in America and hiring American employees at Sony factory outside of Cleveland and Mitsubishi right outside of St. Louis because they can now get American workers at a much cheaper hourly wage, and then the radio goes off. or your doorbell suddenly, miraculously rings, or suddenly you decide, boy, I got to go to the bathroom. If you could have been clinically aware of what was going on, the yellow circuit was reaching a point that it was about to blow a fuse. It was smoking. It was overloaded. But normally it doesn't notice it. Normally it would blame somebody. It's kidneys. I had to leave. The electricity went off. I didn't hear the rest of it. Or they don't describe things right. I'm not interested in damn economics anyway. Or fuck the Japanese. Who cares? The whole country's going to hell. And they do not notice. They're not supposed to. They don't notice. The only thing that happened is the tolerance, not speaking psychologically or spiritually, the tolerance of my thinking machine has reached its limit. And what do? The human is arranged in a beautiful way. You blame somebody. Damn Con Ed. The power's always going off. My radio hadn't gone off. I bet somebody could explain that to my satisfaction. Or as I said, just, quote, suddenly, you've heard enough. What the hell were those people? The way we slaved their ass after the war. We conquered them, then we helped raise them up. Now they're taking jobs out of our pocket. Or damn the Republicans. That's what happens when you get them in office. And all that happened was your consciousness reached the limits of its tolerance. It would not any longer operate. Now, I'm not talking psychologically, I'm talking physiologically. It wouldn't operate. And what you do is you blame the components. You blame the chips and resistors and the capacitors of your own thinking equipment. Or you blame somebody's overloaded me. Somebody didn't give me the right information. And of course, if you're a well-balanced, adjusted person in life, you don't really have to single out anybody who says, "Ah, fuck all that shit. Who gives a damn? I'll turn on a rock station. I'll find James Brown and let him scream. Who cares about economy? We're all going to die anyway. They're going to throw me out of my apartment. I can't even pay next month's rent. And I'm worried about whether people are getting equal wages across the border in Mexico compared to us." That good old attitude. Carry you right along. All of you should be able to recognize, though, as it begins to happen. I use the word dissatisfied originally, but to recognize that there is a place in which the tolerance, the absolute physical tolerance of your thinking equipment is reached. And you've got to become aware of that. It is a lesson to be learned. It is a sight to behold. And to realize that normally there is a kind of very mechanical gap that you jump from the limits of that tolerance into things that have no profitable connection, such as getting mad at somebody else. And all that happened was the tolerance of your own understanding, of your own consciousness was reached. And as I said, it begins, you'll have occasion that will happen in regards apparently to this kind of activity, that I almost got it. I almost have thoughts I'm just sure is going to blow my head apart, and you're right. But it goes through a process before you can get new systems ignited, that the tolerance of what you have now, the tolerance of your equipment gets reached. And just as though it shuts down. You got to be able to find not just a 7-Eleven store of consciousness, you got to find a 24-hour. And, of course, I must admit, nobody's wired up for 24-hour consciousness. You got to build your own place. The most you're ever going to find 7-Eleven. Of course, if you live in the backwater, if you hang around an oasis or just a town, as opposed to even a city, it's where you find the 7-Eleven closes at 10 o'clock anyway. So you're always behind. Let's turn the tape over. Has anyone ever considered this? If not, here's your opportunity. The reason for the apparent passion behind the desire to change, the reason that urge in people to change seems so passionate, is for one reason. It's because the stakes are so low. That ultimately, when it gets to an individual case, it's meaningless. I guess I should be a little more practical after those kind of those come from books that I've yet to identify. Next paragraph. It is okay to get caught, but not to confess. Now I can apparently go ahead with this and be talking about external conditions, but as always you've got to see that there is an internal parallel, and therein is the significance. It's okay to get found out. It is all right to get caught, to say the least, since you've got no choice. Although it's okay to get caught, it is not okay to confess. Now, you surely understand, if you're listening to this right quick, that the ordinary arrangement for people, everyone else, and your own partnership and our corporation is, when you get caught, you confess. That's the name of the structure. That's the name of the arrangement in ordinary life. But I'm telling you people, inasmuch as it is unavoidable, the first part, that it's okay to get caught, but not to confess. You should never admit to a, quote, weakness. You should never make any admission whatsoever. If captured, I shall not talk. If tortured, I will only, whatever you do, I'll scream! Or if you're so inclined, I guess whimper. What you can do is you can offer an insouciant, clinical account of your own DNA print culpably being yet again itself. But I tell you that the only way that that is acceptable once you begin to see it yourself is tied within those will be adjectives or adverbs. Oh, I don't know, and I don't care. Fuck it. Insouciant and clinical. I decided to start using clinical since I always have to apologize for and explain objective, since it's impossible for binary consciousness, and since I have to say I know it's impossible, and yet I'm pointing it out, and so I decided clinical, one of its synonymous words is objective. So we'll all trick ourselves. You've got to be insouciant, you've got to be indifferent, and you've got to be clinical. That is, you've got to be extremely objective and precise. Which if you're insouciant, you're always precise. Only the indifferent can be precise, which leaves out all scientists, leaves out all religious thinkers. It leaves everyone out because everyone else takes it as a serious matter. You've got to be indifferent to be precise. No one else. See, they believe that they are admitting. Yes, dear, I'm sorry I shouldn't have yelled out at you when you asked me about that, but I had a hard day. That's not a real excuse, but I hope it's an explanation, and I'm sorry. Sincere? Even if people said, I do that, the little lady likes it, but sincere? No, it's not all that sincere, I guess. Sometimes I just do it. What could be more sincere than that? It's like people believing that I am surrounded in the world by people with ulterior motives. That people are perhaps subconsciously, even those who say, hi, glad to see you, I bet subconsciously a lot of them know me for what I am, and they're laughing at me and they don't really like me. That's like believing, can I follow this great mystic, this minister? What if it's just a trick? What if he's a fake? What if all my friends are fake? What if everybody likes me, he's putting on? What if everybody likes me is actually a fake? And all the people who say they don't like me are sincere. It's okay to get caught, but not to confess. The few should never confess. What if everybody likes me, he's putting on? What if everybody likes me is actually a fake? And all the people who say they don't like me are sincere. It's okay to get caught, but not to confess. The few should never confess. But you have got to, if you're living, and you're going to live somewhere in a community, and those that belong here, you can see that you live simultaneously in 3 levels of community life. And to be minimally civil, it's all right to make, apparently first off externally, to make insouciant, and it shouldn't be noticeable in the case of other people, of course. It should appear to be sincere. But it should be insouciant and it should be clinical, of simply noting that, yeah, I'm me again. The real importance herein, as you should know, is the way in which you're dealing with your own partnership, the way in which you're apparently dealing with yourself. That here I am, I've either been caught apparently by external forces, or I've simply caught myself again. There is no admission to be made. Don't ever admit anything. It's you who caught yourself. Well, there I did. I hollered out at somebody, it's my temper again. Jesus. I'm sure that's my major weakness. I'm sure that's holding me back from reaching Buddhahood. You're making a grave mistake. You're wasting your time. You're bleeding yourself. You might as well be a leech doctor or a barber. You should not confess. That's not okay. But you can make an insouciant, a clinical notation that your own DNA profile, yet again, has shown itself. And all you got to be is clinical, that is extremely precise and objective, and insouciant, clinically indifferent. Without those 2 aspects of it, you're admitting. And as long as you admit, you'll remain a captive. As long as whatever seems to be the forces can cause you to make admissions over and over, can further divide up your admission, well, admit it. You came here to spy on us, if we're going to go to an external example right quick. No, I didn't. Slap him around. Okay, yeah, I did. All right, you came here to spy on our naval activities, didn't you? No, 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 no. Stick those nails back under his fingernails. Ooh, okay. It wasn't the Navy, though. I came here to spy on your aerial activities. Okay. And you're spying for, let's see, Albania. No. Hit him. Greece. No. Hit him. Rome. No. Hit him. The Slavs. Yep. There is no end to it. You'll remain a captive forever as long as you will confess. You got to understand, they'll keep you alive. They'll prop you up. They'll give you a little warm water periodically with some lemon juice in it. They may let you suck on your thumb or your neighbor's thumb to stay alive, and they'll slap you around again the next day. As long as you confess today, they'll keep you alive one more day and slap you around tomorrow. And it goes on, and you continue, I confess. You do know I'm not talking about being in a concentration camp in the external world. It's being your own confined self, as long as you'll confess to weakness, as long as you'll confess to anything. That yeah, I've been caught, and I'll admit it, I'll confess. Then this partnership, this arrangement, this condition of consciousness will stay extant yet again, at least one more day. And tomorrow you'll confess anew. You'll continue to divide it up until it becomes meaningless. You'll confess to anything. You can be accused of things that you never thought about. And you'll go, well, I never thought about it, but I guess if I was in the right condition, I'd probably do that. I guess you're right. I never have done it, but yeah, you're probably right, I would. Or on the contrary, think, heavens no, I wouldn't, and I should hit you and me in the nose for even thinking about it. That's admission. You might also understand why, if there are people who understand anything on this planet, they're never interviewed. Have you ever read an interview anywhere that you got through the interviewer somewhere and you thought, Jesus Christ, this person knows something? No. Well, if you thought so, of course, you're next in line. They'll interview you next. Shows how much you understand. People who understand anything are never interviewed. And if by some accident, if they'd interviewed everybody in the world, except this one person, they got around to them, they wouldn't admit they'd never been interviewed. They'd say you've done it already under another name. They'd do something. They would not be interviewed. Because to be interviewed is to make admissions. And of course, to be interviewed, you got to be interesting to start with. If you have nothing to confess, you're not interesting. Those who cannot stop immediate admission is why I threw in the last part, or the second part of this, is it is all right. Because if you try and use it, and if you try and utilize and see what it is, and how it is built into the original unity of it all, you can make this kind of insouciant, this almost silly, not externally, that's not even the point, not to other people, but to yourself. Remember, it's the lack of treating the partnership seriously. But remember, you cannot laugh at a rabbi. Forget how he looks and the way they act. You can't laugh at the Pope. Forget the way he's dressed and all these things they do. You can't do in those two cases. You cannot do that and remain a Jew or be a Catholic. It has got to be taken seriously. The institutions of the community must be taken seriously. You must take the partnership seriously or you will not stay in business with it. Just thought I'd throw that in for the economic lesson for the evening. But you can make this kind of silent arrangement wherein you're continually caught, and most of the times it seems that some way you have been caught up in your own traps and your own devices. It's your own mind accusing you. It's your own conscience pointing the finger of accusation. Whatever the terms seem most appropriate to your own partnership arrangement. The thing is, aha, I've been caught. I confess. Don't do that. Or they'll slap you around, they'll keep you alive one more day, and they'll slap something else out of you and there's no end to it. But if you cannot just simply stop it, what I'm telling you is you can find a way that, all right, I will make. This all seems sincere enough within you. It's no big trick to do this. If it is, you don't belong here. If you can't be anything as near a phony as you should be, if you can't approach, if you can't appreciate even from afar the great cosmic phoniness of people like Moses and Buddha and Jesus and Pee Wee Herman, then you don't understand what's going on. So under this absolute simple sugar, simple syrup, glaze put upon it that sparkles with sincerity, it has got to be no more than a clinical and succinct notation that my own DNA profile, the print, my own genes have yet again, surprise, surprise, they have yet again been themselves. And those who belong at this particular strange edge of the concentration camp, close to the fence, you'll find out that that is workable. They'll take that for a while, long enough to get out of there. But don't confess. Do not be sincere. Do not admit to anything other than, that's all you can do is admit that my genes, my DNA have been me again. But you've got to be clinical. That is extremely precise and objective. Remembering that's impossible, that's why we're calling it clinical from now on. You've got to be clinical with the admission, and you have got to be insouciant, even though you may not be French. It sounds to be a bit more sophisticated than indifferent. You can do that, and they'll let you go to bed. You can do that, and sometimes they will not call you over to the black hole again tomorrow. They'll accept it sometimes. You go for days, you go for weeks. Something begins to happen to them. On the surface, they take these insouciant clinical notations of your own DNA acting up yet again, and yet you will find that something seems to be lacking, that the whole arrangement seems to need the kind of energy. It seems to enjoy more those who will confess every day, that they can slap around, threaten, and they'll confess to anything. They'll continue to divide up their confessions into smaller and smaller pieces. That's where the proper kinds of energy are being transferred, not with insincere mutants, especially when they appear to be serious, even deadly so. I don't want anyone, of course, by any means trying to look like me, but you could go home and practice at least every night and first thing in the morning, looking deadly serious in the mirror, in the bathroom, while you're brushing your teeth or doing. But remember, inside you have got to be totally insouciant. But on top of that, if you can look deadly serious, those of you who didn't have much practice learn how to raise one eyebrow, look how to really be serious, that you might be on the verge of confessing something really bad, but you never do. I will not be interviewed. Oh, okay, if you insist. But then you don't tell them anything. You give them wrong names, false information. And if they won't buy that, give them real information. I got a question. I'm going to use an example that is germane at this particular time to the locale, to the community from which I'm physically speaking right now. That there is renewed interest and concern over pornography. And don't anybody get entangled by the example. I'm just picking out one that readily came to my sight and mind in the last few days. And there are reflections of this throughout our larger community of this country right now. At any rate, I was a little behind, and in my attempt to keep up for very clinical reasons, at a newsstand the other day I picked up a girly magazine, one that I hadn't seen in several years. And while looking at it, I found it was replete with pictures, more or less, photographs, almost, of sexual acts, except at the extreme place where the act would be taking place. Certain, shall I say, openings in the human body and certain protrusions wherein the two might meet, regardless of what Horace Greeley said. Although they were there in living color, there would be big black circles and squares and triangles covering up, I believe a psychologist would say, the good stuff. Oh, sure, you could see a woman's face and you could see a man's. It wasn't his face, it was kind of at the other end, and you could see him getting real close, and then right there would be this big black circle covering it up. But then as I was standing there glancing through it, it was full of letters to the editor, it was full of captions going along with the photographs. They were supposed to be telling some story. And I didn't have to stand there and search for it, you just glance down, and all the written words in this magazine, a nationally distributed magazine, was full of so-called four-letter words. The writing was just an exemplary pornography. You follow me? It was describing all the things that the black circles and squares were covering up, right there next to it. All right. I repeat one more time, I am not talking about pornography, I'm not talking about morality, I'm talking about a situation in life, and then I want to ask you something. That here it is that apparently the large community presently has said that you cannot show photographs of a pornographic nature. But then again, this large community, judged upon me looking at this magazine, this nationally distributed magazine, it has not yet clamped down on written pornography right there next to it in the same magazine. I'm talking about just as written, every word, every description that you could think about, you just stood there and glanced at, 10 seconds, and there they all were. Now, my question, when I'm trying to point your interest to, is not in the field of morality, it's in the field of circuitry. What is it that life is up to, that right now, just right now, the description I've given you, whether it changes tomorrow or whatnot, we're talking about right this second. That is the description I'm giving you this second. What could possibly be going on in life's overall scheme of things that at some time it forbids picturized pornography, and right next to it allows written pornography describing that which is blacked out? Now, you're going to miss it if you just laugh or say, fall back in the cynical partnership of playing life's critic. What possibly is going on in the needed transfer of energies in the greater scheme of life growing and evolving that it, in this particular instance, would forbid picturized pornography right here, and right next to it give absolute free rein to written pornography, the descriptions of that which they won't show in pictures. Circuitry. I'm giving you a hint. That's a hint. Circuitry! You can't look at the pictures. That's all right. Right next to it, right there, that column, it'll describe it for you. With no literary, no verbal holds barred. Circuitry. Community. Forget community standards. The three possible communities in everyone. What could life be doing at any particular time that would say you cannot look at this, but you can read about it? Sayonara. False ending. I had several questions I wanted to mention tonight. From last week, question, Does efficiency mean lack of resistance? Does efficiency mean lack of resistance? Three-dimensionally, it would seem absolutely so, would it not? What could be more efficient than that which had no resistance? Would that not be the height of efficiency in a situation? That there was no extant resistance? Ultimately, I gave you, in your own partnership, sufficient time there to understand that, well, hell yeah, that'd have to be true. But under such a condition, it would ultimately render whatever the thing or the process under discussion might be, it would render it non-extant. And yet, in the 3D world being that world in which binary consciousness operates, it would be absolutely unconditionally correct that the most efficient process would be wherein there was no resistance. That efficiency would mean lack of resistance. And yet if you could see three-dimensionally in a 4D world, at the very least, if you're not limited to binary consciousness, in other words, you would see that if such an occurrence happened, ultimately, and that might only take a matter of seconds in a four-dimensional world, or in a higher dimension, that ultimately, whatever it was under consideration, under discussion, the thing we're talking about that had a lack of resistance, it would be rendered non-extant. More than moot, worse than useless, non-extant. Now let me ask you, who could see that this could be used in one's relationship to what? My mother-in-law? No. To the partnership. Right. Well, now, if you're going to work on yourself, you got to work on yourself. You got to shore up your weak points. You got to be prepared to admit your shortcomings. You got to be able to confess. I thought we just went through that. I don't know. I thought somewhere when I saw this question that there might be of some possible use that internally, what if you could treat the partner? Well, no. What if you offered up no resistance? No. What if you approach the arbitrary drives of your own partner? Well, I guess this is indeed too serious a matter for me to just give you an off the head like a flippant answer. It's too serious. I guess I'll file this away and give it its due. We'll get back to this later. Here's why I'm just going to extract the heart, the part I wanted to use. Somebody points out, well, I'm not even going to paraphrase. I'm going to tell you the gist of what this question and this observation. The person was pointing out that it seems that throughout their life, whenever they get started doing something, that life shuts them off, that they lose their footing, that they feel as though they have compromised what they started and it never works out. Let me refine it. Let me be clinical with it. It's a feeling, and it's not uncommon in people. The majority of humans are wired up to be susceptible to this to varying degrees. Some people indeed suffer over it to a large degree, and then others of you, even here, have it to lesser degrees. The feeling that I continually fail, and not just in some great metaphysical sense of my entire life, but that you could, if asked about it, enumerate businesses you started, plans you started, courses you started to pursue educationally, that you would look back if asked about it right now, and you and the partnership could see a continuing pattern of starting things, and there was always, if you went ahead and admitted it, damn it. Sure, I've tried to rationalize it away, I guess, at the time, but looking back now, it's been a continuing series of things I started, and I'll admit it to you. I'll confess, I failed at them. Something would always happen. I might blame somebody else. I might say, well, I changed my mind, I changed my plans in mid-plan. But the truth is, it's the feeling that I have continually failed. Maybe they would seem to be small. Maybe I can look at them as being less than cosmically significant looking back over it. And yet, it is an extremely tough feeling to live with, to have the sensation, the general sensation of failure. Now, with ordinary people, as always, you've got to understand that it's of no particular consequence. But for the few, this feeling that I have failed, that my life has been a continuing series of small, middle-sized, large, combined failures, you've got to be able to see that as being an occupational description and not a personal one. It is impossible to live with that general sensation and do this simultaneously. But there are people, as I said, they're wired up for that. It's not a psychological problem. It's not something that happened to you. There's nothing to talk about. But those of you who do suffer from this, I am going ahead and make the clinical diagnosis and description for you. It is tough to live with that. It's impossible to live with that general sensation and to do this properly. And you have got to see that if your life indeed has been that way, that what you're dealing with is a job description. It might as well come from the Washington bureaucracy. It is a job description, and if you're doing this, it is no longer a personal description. Or else you cannot deal with this. You will sink. It is simply tough to live with. And it is so tough that you will never do this correctly. But I did want to make this clinical notation for you, that everyone almost on this planet has a little piece of that, has the potential to feel that way. But there are people in this group. It's no big secret. Some of you can probably look around and think about people in the group, and you, before getting involved with this, you might have wanted to give some psychological explanation, some suspicion that probably something happened in their life, their parents browbeat them. But there are people that you can almost look at and realize that they feel as though their life has been just continuing failures. Anything they try, they're going to fail at. That is tough. That is double tough. To try and do this and to live with that, taking that as a personal description of you, is impossible. Once you see that it may be your job description, now we got a different matter. Once you begin to see that now I can recognize the community from whence I came. Remember some years back, I guess it was too obtuse at the time, I pointed out to you, or I may have let Kyroot do it, that you cannot truly say goodbye to a place until you know it. You cannot leave your community until you understand I was born in this community. I had nothing to do with it. My parents had nothing to do with it. And I was born with a job classification. I was born being Fred to the 1029th power. And this particular job description may be of a male human being who apparently, through his own ill-founded partnership, shaky corporate structure, continues to initiate apparently, and then pursue failing endeavors. That is my job description, and as they say on the corner, sure, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Now on with what I am trying to do, which is this. My job is being a fuck-up. My hobby, me personally, is this. Another part they throw in, they said, is this in any way connected with what I have heard you say, that if you don't act right, you don't feel right? And then they try and chop that up further, but I'll just take it. Is this connected with me saying if you don't act right, you don't feel right? C. But note this, for an ordinary person, that's meaningless to say if you don't act right, you don't feel right. I mean, hell, that might as well be a cannon from the Pope, or even just perhaps a .22 ricochet from a cardinal. But for an ordinary person, it would be meaningless. But for the few, if you can understand, it would be an absolute holy cliche. If you don't act right, you don't feel right. But if the way you act, trying to do this, if the way you act as though you are your job description, then you never feel right, which is the way you're supposed to feel. That's part of your job description. And so you'll never act right. And you got a good story. Well, I can't act right. I continue to fuck up. Right. Would you help me? Sure. Would you really help me? Yes, I will. That's what I'm here for. You're probably going to tell me my weakness, and really, yes, I am. You think I cannot be sincere when I want to? I took lessons from Barney, or I should have. Now, damn it, for the final time, sayonara, siranura, siranota. A task for everyone, everywhere. And don't think that you have done a variation of this before, because you haven't. You did a variation. It was kindergarten variation, some of you. But now I'm going to give you one that I won't. On everyone's part, I'm expecting absolute clinical insouciance. That is serious with a double S. I'm going to give everyone 2 weeks. That should be enough, unless something extreme is going on in your life. But I expect within reason, anybody who can, within 2 weeks, I want you to do this. I want you to go to 4 different religious institutions, a temple, a mosque, 4 extremely different Protestant churches, if that's the best you can do. Now, if you grew up in one of these, in a particular denomination, save it for last. If you grew up in a Jewish household, of course, go to a Catholic church, go to an Episcopal church, go to if you could find a mosque around, go to an Assembly of God church, pick out diverse places, and then lastly, the last time, go to a temple somewhere, but go to one that you didn't grow up in, if possible. Just where you're a stranger. If none of you had any particular feeling that you grew up in a religion, that's not important. That's not even the heart of the matter. So just go to 4 different ones. But now here's what I want you to do. Go to regular scheduled meetings. I want you to go there with the intent to clinically observe and to try and answer this question to yourself non-verbally with no punctuation, not even commas. But go there and try to be a clinical, insouciant, free-for-all drifter along with whatever's going on. And I want you to try and neuralize. I want you to try and perceive. I want you to try and feel what kind of diverse energies these institutions, these services, these rituals, these leaders, these performers, but the institution as a whole, what diverse energy apparently they are offering the audience, the participants, the attendees. Now, I don't mean just in some vague way, and if you go and you don't get anything out of this, I'll say forget it. But I am going to be extremely concerned if any of you don't get anything. And if you get anything worthy of any sort of written report, drop me a note, drop me a card, a line. That's not the real point. I want you to go there, that you go in the first time and you go into a church that is foreign to your background, just one that has no importance, remember. It's all a matter of the relative wiring, apparently the relative experience of people. But for you to go into a religious institution, that their whole services are foreign to what you grew up observing, if anything. You're not there as critic, you're not there really as any sort of serious observer. What you're trying to feel is something is going on with these people, that the community of the church is passing along some kind of energy to the community of the attendees, and it is diverse. The attendees at a temple, you've got to be able to feel it. And we're not talking about better, worse. There's no degree of quality, no degree of it. But a Jewish service is apparently conveying some energy from the institution to the attendees that is dissimilar to a charismatic, fundamentalist Protestant institution. Energy is apparently being conveyed to their attendees. And for the Catholic Church, the institution of the church, through its rituals, its music, its ambiance, is another kind of community energy being passed from the community of that institution to the community of the followers. Now I want you to see, remember, verbally is not the point. You don't have to send me anything. You don't have to write it down, because you should not come to any hardwired conclusion. But by now you should be able to get a real feel. You should be able, many of you getting close to the real process of neuralization, that if you were forced to, you could suddenly give an answer for the first time in your life. You could give perhaps a one-word description, 3 or 4-word description of the diversity of what's going on at a Jewish institution and their apparent religious followers compared to what I see here with this Assembly of God and their followers. It is diverse. They are both equally valid. They are both serving purposes, but they are diverse. But within them, there is a community going on. There is the community of the institution that apparently is the church, that is the religion, that is the culture of the religion. And there is the community of the followers, the attendees, the adherents to it. And energies are being transferred. And of course, you people, you know not to get entrapped by the so-called importance of it being religious. You could be attending a hockey game compared to a basketball game, compared to a chess tournament, compared to a polo match. It just seems as though that the religions, the institutions, the communities of religion are singular in their import. But I want you to treat it as though it is a performance. It is a community. It is a transfer of energy from the institution, apparently from the individual performer, in the case of many of these fundamentalist churches, that the whole church seems to be just centered on the preacher, the minister, the prophet. And other times, like the Catholic Church, some of the Episcopal rituals, it would seem as though perhaps that the head man, the head person, is interchangeable. You don't even know his name. It could be anybody up there. It's the ritual. It's the whole apparent psychological / spiritual ambiance of it. It's a performance. It's the transfer of inter-community energy. But it's diverse. Now I want you to go to 4 within 2 weeks. They're regularly scheduled performances. what do you call them? 4 as different as you can make it, and if you wish, if you grew up in one, you can go to it, but make it the 4th one, make it the last one.